So much better. Okay, so what I was saying was, and we managed to mess around until you got back here. Is Lavrov's in India, and India is important to Russia right now because it's one of their biggest oil partners right now. If you look at the chart of where Russian oil and gas has gone from, everywhere it's tapered off on the Russian side of things, or on the European side of things, it has gone largely to China and India. By the way, at a severe discount, I might add. And so it's very meaningful. You know, their relationship with India is very important for them right now. Oops, dropped. There he is. Okay, so did you see this? They're trying to sort of like
Oh
India's
yeah,
G20. Yeah. So he
yeah.
said, um, uh, he was talking about how at a conference in India, he said that the Ukraine war, quote, was launched against us. And the whole crowd at this thing laughed in his face.
Burst into
And
laughter.
and then somebody in the crowd shouted, "Come on," which in and of itself is amazing. That in India, even in India, people are yelling American colloquialisms for malarkey. And
Well, and he was also speaking in English, which
yes.
he doesn't always speak in English at these
Hmm.
conferences. He oftentimes does the whole I as a representative of Russia must speak in Russian
Right.
because their language is so important to them. Their great rich language, the Bugatti Yesik they call it.
Hmm.
So I found it interesting he was speaking in English, and then when the laughter happened, I thought it was very funny that almost you could see it almost like dead behind the eyes, kind of like I'll just keep talking. He didn't acknowledge it, but you
Sure.
could see that he that there was a little shroud that came over his face when he realized that the audience was calling him on his baloney. Yeah, that was good.
Yeah.
That was very funny to see.
Um, there was I mean, I suppose face means, as much to the Russians to some degree in terms of their
Mm.
machismo, almost as it does to the Chinese in terms of overall status in something. And there have been, I want to say two, you know, well, one of the guys who worked on the Russian vaccine uh, died mysteriously a couple days ago. He was apparently strangled by a male prostitute in his apartment, which, on the one hand, sad and awful and what have you. On the other hand, it sounds an awful lot like the kind of thing that Russia does when they want you to die and nobody to ask questions. So they make your death so uncomfortable. If you're a confirmed bachelor, they paint you as gay and kill you that way, or what have you. It very well may have just been exactly that. He might have just been strangled by you know, by who he hired. But it's interesting that he was involved in the Sputnik 5 vaccine, which hasn't been all that great. And that's something we're not
No,
even talking about right now. As as China is dealing again with the end of zero COVID and the rise of cases, which they've just stopped mentioning, so as if it's just going to go away. And we're talking, tens of thousands of hospitalized cases a day right now, ongoing for months now. And Russia shares a border with them. A lot of their villages have a lot of interconnectivity. um, China insisted on full opening, so they were to show the world that everything's fine, and so they're just letting it roll over everybody. So they're almost forcing travel back and forth. That, like, there might have been a region that was spared because nobody goes anywhere, but they just sent people there anyways. That more than likely are, have every flight in China has, a dozen people who have some form of COVID. They haven't even been hit with the Delta variant yet. It's just terrifying, and the fact that they're interacting with Russians across the border, and those people are being called up to go to the front lines. God knows what the hell they're dealing with.
Yeah, and well, if there's a silver lining to the sanctions for the Russians, and when it comes to COVID, it's that their internal their domestic internal consumer flights have slowed to a trickle. Not even
Right.
their international, but because they can't maintain their air fleet. I mean, and this is coming from a friend of mine who works
Hmm.
for an airline, and she got out of Russia, but she still is in contact with her colleagues, and that's what she's relaying to me. So that it might be anecdotal, but regardless, I mean, the way Russia has handled or the way Russia handled the pandemic, continues to handle the pandemic, was awful. I mean, and we know very well that they hid their numbers.
Hmm.
There was
Right.
a medical a woman from the Ministry of Health who went and who was a whistleblower, and she started coming out and saying, we see what's happening in the cities. What's really happening, though, is in the rural areas. Nothing's being done to protect these people, and they're dying in huge numbers. So we don't. And look, Russia has a major population problem. It has a population growth problem. It has an aging population that they're not allowing keep people coming up. Their
Hmm.
their mortality rate is comparatively low. It's the last time it was effectively studied, it was 59 for
Hmm.
men was the mortality rate, which is just
Right.
crazy.
Right.
Um, so all of that kind of stuff is as they come out of COVID and now they go into a war where they're just throwing bodies at the thing. I don't, Russia's going to have to deal with this population issue that it has very soon. It's going to exacerbate things when it loses this war as well, because what happens with what Russia is, and is there any growth to be had in Russia? Will Russia break apart? Will Russia implode? And all these issues of population are going to be part of it. So
Right.
yeah, that's definitely going on.
And there is again, that's one of those situations where, quite frankly, there just is no exit. There kind of cannot
No.
be. You don't just automatically print a bunch of people who can procreate, especially if you're sending the vast majority of them to die to capture a town that holds 70,000 people in another country that never did anything to you. So
Hmm.
and let's just say this ends, some of them go home, all that kind of stuff. They're still going to deal with the scars of war like every other country has dealt with the trauma, the alcoholism, especially in Russia, which is a country that would avoid even conversations about mental health in regard to the damage done during war. And there it,
And where alcoholism is rampant, and not only that, but culturally, even aside from alcoholism, drinking is part of a machismo culture, and it's how much you can drink really kind of like is part of who you are as a man. Your
right.
sense of in the pecking order when you kind of are socializing, that's part of it. It's intrinsic to their society. So,
Right.
yeah, I mean, and then it also there's been those who say that might have been a motivation for the war, because the population, this might be, it's now or never, because the population is
Yes.
falling apart. Maybe they'd hope to annex Ukraine, which has better birth rates. Maybe it might have something to do why they're stealing tens of thousands of children
Hmm.
and abducting them and taking them back to Russia. Um, I mean, I don't know how much of this is a major contributing factor, but it wouldn't shock me at all to learn that it's a contributing factor for
Well,
sure.
yeah,
Russia's in a really crisis point when it comes to their population.
right. And as is China. So the two of them pairing up right now. And the interesting thing is, you got two countries, everybody's like, oh my God, we're going to drive them into each other's arms. This is how Trump referred to it last week. That's his big fear, that they're going to get together. I got news for you, though. Both countries are pretty darn racist when it comes to the populations of their countries as a whole. They might be all right with other races being in their places, but they're both Russia and China are big on international segregation.
Mhm.
they believe, the vast
There's another
majority.
thing that,
Yeah,
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 there's another thing that Trump, I'm sure, was not aware of, and that's that the Chinese and the Russians hate one another,
right,
have a long history of going to war with one another, of being of annexing territory of one another, of conflict with one another, and this goes back to the foundation of
yeah,
Russia itself with the Mongols and the Golden Horde. I mean, and they have a fear of China, kind of encroaching on them from their soft
right.
underbelly and their far east, and there is that blatant racism. Yes, they hate one
Yeah,
another.
right.
They,
We have to
so
take a break. I personally believe that everything Russia does right now is under the sort of the paranoid umbrella of, is the person I'm friends with or that's helping me right now secretly hiding a knife behind their back? And the answer is increasingly yes. We'll be back right after this. It's the House Parks Radio program, Mega Worldwide on WCPT Radio, Chicago's Progressive Talk. Now with 100% more Johnny Million, twitch.tv/it's Johnny Million. And of course, Philip Bittner at Philip Bittner on Twitter, 1L, 2T's. And then, of course, you can follow him and go to Philip Bittner on YouTube and watch his vlog. We'll be back.
You're locked into the House Sparks radio program, Mega Worldwide.
Welcome back. There's a myriad of things to discuss currently. At this point, we are almost in the sort of wind up part of what's coming next. I think there have been a couple of times during this war where there's an anticipation factor on it. And the anticipation always seems to be, here come the Russians. And it's been sold by the far right and the far left in the United States. And by the way, a report came out this week that the Chinese are spending $1 billion on pro-Russia, anti-Ukraine propaganda in the West, funding outlets, boost campaigns, adding like view boosts to videos and things that they like. So the shows of our recurring squad of tankies, for example, will get a boost to a third more views on their videos each, because they're being paid for by the Chinese government. $1 billion. This is where they can't. I think they're in a situation where they can't give direct arms, and if they get caught, they'll get sanctioned. So they're doing this on the DL and doing it this is just PR essentially. But they are spending it on effectively what is effectively a psyop. And they're spending $1 billion of it on it in just the last couple of months, and then going forward, they're going to continue this. And that's, by the way, even though they're broke and even though the Chinese are in a tough spot, for the government, it's chump change in that regard. And that's part of the agreement that they probably made with Russia. That's what Russia's getting instead of guns, instead of artillery shells, instead of drones from the Chinese. They're getting this psyop, upkeep from them. The interesting thing
wouldn't
is
surprise me. No.
the more they do it, the less it works, because the anti-Ukraine Republicans in the House, Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, are largely causing that issue to jump the shark. And the gathering at CPAC that, where Marjorie Taylor Greene brought up 3 times apropos of nothing how she didn't want any more money going to Ukraine, and did that weird kind of smile that she does right after saying it. And she spoke directly to Zelensky, looked right in the camera, and said, "You're not going to take our sons and daughters to die in Ukraine," which is like goofy.
That was in the, yeah. No, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just saying, like, that the crowd was half empty, and the applause was kind of perfunctory. It was not the kind of thing where people are really rallying. Whatever she's selling, she's getting fewer and fewer customers, which I take as a good sign.
Yeah, I think the $1 billion infusion from the Chinese into Russian psyops. Sadly, I agree with you. Ultimately, there's a ceiling about how effective that kind of stuff can be because the Chinese aren't nearly as good at it as the Russians are. But it will have an effect, and
Yes.
I am very concerned about that messaging finding at least some traction in
Sure.
the United States. Now, I'm pushing back about against it as much as I can. There's some stuff that I'm doing that I'm not able to talk about quite yet, but
Hmm.
I will soon.
Right.
But I do think there's a danger, frankly, because nobody likes war.
Hmm.
There is a desire, any human being with empathy wants the war to end, but they have to understand that a bad victory for the Ukrainians is not acceptable. It's because they'll come back again. This has to be concluded. This has to be finished so that
Hmm.
it doesn't happen anymore. But what I thought was interesting about Green's statement during CPAC, where she did that whole looking into the camera and saying, "I'm not sending any of our daughters or sons," that was in reaction to Zelensky having a press conference around the 1 year anniversary mark in which
Hmm.
he said what he said was, and she purposely, she
Yeah.
must, well, I'd say she must know, but she's
She
so
purposely
stupid, maybe
inverted
she
it.
didn't know. Or yeah, or willfully inverted it. But what Zelensky said was, if you do not support us, today it's Ukrainians fighting and dying. If you don't support us and we don't stop Russia today in this war, tomorrow it will be your sons and daughters fighting this war.
Yeah.
Meaning Russia ain't gonna stop. And
Right.
and also what I really am worried about is this, because there's so much to latch on. The amount of money that's being spent, the Lend Lease program is so poorly understood in the West and in the United
Hmm.
States. The empathy of seeing pain and suffering and death and just wanting it to be over, that like
Right.
strong desire. I do worry about support for Ukraine waning, but I don't think it's going to be come into effect in any time before. Again, I still think this is not going to go into years and years and years. Sadly, I think it might border around the end of 23, beginning of 24, which is not what I would have hoped. A few months ago, I was saying I was hoping it was going to be in, towards the end of summer sort of period.
Hmm.
That sadly it may not be that way. We'll have to see. It's way too early to say. We have to see what happens on the
Have you?
battlefield this summer.
Uh,
But I am
right.
worried about support for the war. I hope it won't wane. But I know that the Ukrainians are going to keep fighting because this is an existential threat.
Right. Azamat Maitanov, who's a Kazakh journalist, is reporting that that Kadyrov is terminally ill from kidney disease, and
Well, have
I
you
don't know
seen
what
him
his.
recently?
No, I have not.
I mean,
He.
he is
Yeah.
bloated.
Oh,
He is on some serious steroids or
steroids.
something. So,
Right.
some sort of treatment that is causing him to plump up like nobody's business. Uh, and it's not just rich living. There's something
Right.
going on. So I don't. Yeah, I think that's entirely possible.
And so one of the other obviously the big story, I think, is this explosion that happened inside Moscow that was a believed to be a Ukrainian cruise missile that struck inside the country, and that they had sent a drone to see if it could be stopped by the Russian air defenses. It wasn't. They just landed it someplace. They just crashed it and didn't left it because it wasn't a big deal. And then they sent a missile on the same path, knowing that it was basically an open gap in it. And they are apparently able to target places in Belarus if Belarus enters the war or tries to help again.
Yeah, well, they have sent two drones into Belarus. Both of them cheekily flew over and then landed on the dish of these kind of AWACS-looking surveillance planes that are parked in Belarus, these Russian AWACS style. And they just flew in, landed, sat there, flew off, just showing their vulnerability. You're right. There's a lot of stuff that's happening internally within Russia that is very interesting. Not least of with the explosion you're talking about. There was an explosion at a major munitions factory, one of the largest Russian munitions factories. And we talk a lot about Ukraine running low on munitions. So are the Russians. That's a bad thing for them. There's a very weird thing that happened just across the border in a Russian town called Bryansk, where apparently a anti-Putin like Russian independence unit crossed from Ukraine into Russia and held this kind of like new Russia flag. There's a lot of weird stuff going on about that because there's some extremist connections. There's talk that maybe that civilians were killed. That's a little bit murky, and I don't want to go into deep detail about it.
And it's hard to tell
but
whether
a lot
it's
of stuff internally within Russia.
With Russia,
yeah, there's talk it might have been a false flag. That's right.
Right. So my
favorite they killed civilians.
Story, yeah, my favorite.
Or there are civilians that may have died in that incident.
Right, that are alleged to have been killed. Right, that's the hard part again, because it's it's very opaque as far as the genuine details from there.
Yeah.
The State Duma, the Russian Duma, advised private corporations, private business people, to buy their own air defense systems for their factories with their own money. After this, or in relation to this drone coming in and this explosion, they have told the big companies, buy your own anti-missile defense systems. From where? I don't know. Because the companies that are there are just as sanctioned as the government. So, where are they getting from? Iran? Who knows? But they literally advised them to buy their own systems last week. This is according to one of the deputies of the Russian Defense Ministry. They are too busy protecting other projects or areas to protect businesses and the like. So they said they advised businesses to buy air defense systems at their own expense to protect against Ukrainian drones. They are a fairly inexpensive means of combating unmanned aerial vehicles that every self-respecting corporation can purchase and put on their facilities. This propaganda media that they were handing out. Can you imagine? I swear to God, if the United States or even the Ukrainians were just telling, hey, you got a bake shop, you got a Starbucks, you're going to need your own private missile defense system mounted on your roof, which, by the way, would make you look like a hidden military target. It would raise the chances of you being attacked. It's just that part I found amazing. So Kadyrov, I mean, speedy healing. I hope he lives a long life in a prison cell at The Hague or something like that. There's more to cover. We have to take a break because we're nearing the happy ending, and I want to get into the next part because we have some questions. I have no doubt from the chat. I want to do that for the happy ending. We'll ask some questions in there. So we'll be back right after this with Philip Ittner and Johnny Million, and I'm Hal Sparks, and it's the Hal Sparks radio program, Mega Worldwide.